of different decisions in our lives. We have to decide what to wear, what to eat. And when we make those decisions, we can either kind of take our own expert opinion about what's best practice, or we can look at those around us and infer from what they're doing what we should be doing. We can take similar approaches to computational problems. So computational problems today require near constant decision making. So when we think about machine learning, we're having to decide what features to include in classifiers, whether those features are fair to include, whether they'll improve accuracy. And in security, we have to make decisions about what security requirements to set and what behaviors we might want to encourage to protect users. And typically, it's experts who are setting these best practices. So algorithm designers or researchers who provide guidance about how to design classifiers, security professionals, or practitioners who are trying to set requirements and policies. And when experts make these decisions, they're often making trade-offs. And this particular chart comes from a piece of work out of Princeton and Cornell, where the researchers were discussing their decision about whether or not to release a data set that they had worked on publicly. And they said when they were trying to make this decision, they were trying to trade off the benefits to science against the risk to the people in the data set that they might be re-identified. And this type of normative trade-off that experts are making can be similar in the domain of classification. We're trying to trade off classifier accuracy and the unfairness of including certain sensitive features, and hopefully in security as well, where we might want to trade off burden to users against the security gain of requiring them to do something like, let's say, two-factor authentication. And when experts make these trade-offs, they don't always agree. So there's a number of news articles that always come out about experts having to, say, go back on their advice or disagreeing about whether or not you need to reset your password every 3 months, for example. And beyond news articles, there's been research, for example, by a group at Google that found when they asked over 300 people who were experts at a security conference what they would recommend as the top 3 behaviors to protect yourself, over 50% of the experts disagreed with each other, and some of them even said, you know, you really ought to do this behavior. Someone said you never should do. So experts aren't perfect. And perhaps more importantly, users and experts disagree. So users' perception of the unfairness of including a particular feature or the impact of the risk of being re-identified may not necessarily align with how experts perceive the risks to groups that they're not part of. This tension between experts' sort of prescriptive or normative best practice and the descriptive approach of learning from non-expert preference and behavior is one that's been raised well before computing. This is something that came up in moral philosophy when philosophers discussed how you might set laws or rules in a society. They described these 2 different approaches you might take. And in this talk, I'd like to give a set of case studies exploring how we might find kind of a balancing point between descriptive approaches, learning from people's natural behavior and preferences, and normative approaches where we as experts sort of dictate what we think should be happening. These 3 case studies are going to explore 3 different methodologies towards looking at using descriptive approaches in computing problems, and also 3 different domains. So in the first, I'll talk about how we might take descriptive approaches to setting security requirements. So can we infer from people's natural behavior what their preferences might be, and then make decisions that account for those preferences. In the second, we'll talk about trying to determine which features are fair to use in machine learning. And finally, looking at the ethics of allowing content in virtual reality by making decisions with stakeholders. So in this first case study, we'll talk about security requirements. And so as security researchers or practitioners, our goal is often to get people to do some security behavior. So many of us have probably seen a message like this, which is trying to get you to enable two-factor authentication. So when you sign up for an account, it wants you to give them your phone number. And if you don't do it, every time you go and log into that account, or every so often, you get the message again until you comply with what they would like you to do. And we know from past research that people get habituated to these kinds of messages and they start to ignore them. And so we'd like to be able to figure out how best to prompt secure behavior. And in order to do that, we may want to understand on how people respond to prompts and then try to optimize the prompts. So the normative approach, which is what we do today, is it's good for you to do two-factor, I'm going to yell at you until you do it. The descriptive approach would be, can we model how you naturally respond or how you want to do this behavior and try to optimize our nudging in a way that makes more sense. Okay, but in order to do that, we're making the assumption that we can actually find a model of users' behavior in security. And this isn't necessarily an agreed upon assumption. So this is an often cited quote in the security community, which is that the user is going to pick dancing pigs over security every time. So if you give them anything else they can possibly do, they'll do that instead of security. So if we're going to take a descriptive approach, we have to actually see if we can find a robust model of security behavior that we can learn from to do some prompting. In order to see if we can build such a model, we'd like to be able to do some controlled experiments. So in this work, I constructed a behavioral economics experimentation system that allows us to observe people's security behavior at scale with a fairly high level of control. So a lot of times in security, we do observational studies where we look at log data and we see what's happened in the world. This is very useful for ecological validity, but it doesn't really allow me to change many factors because these are people's real accounts. I can't artificially hack them or tell them the risks they're at or control their past experience. And as an alternative, people often use survey studies where they say, well, imagine that you saw this particular prompt, would you enable two-factor? But we know that while surveys are useful for some types of inquiry in security, they're not great for people predicting behavior. That's a hard task. So here we'd like to put people in a realistic type of system where they're going to have a real account, and they're going to have to make decisions about that account. So in particular, in this online experimental system, people create a simple bank account. And that account is going to hold their study compensation. And the study compensation is going to be something they would reasonably care about, like their hourly wage or twice their hourly wage. And they're going to have a risk of being hacked. But in this case, that risk is going to be explicit. I'm going to tell you the probability that your account will get hacked. You're also going to have the opportunity to make a security choice. So you can enable or not enable two-factor authentication. If you enable two-factor authentication, it'll reduce your risk of hacking. I will also be explicit about how much it will reduce that risk. But just like the real world, it will increase your cost to complete the study in time and cognitive effort. And I'm going to measure that cost, and the nice thing about my experimental system is within some windows, I can actually control the cost. So I can figure out, I'd like this message to show up in your SMS box in about 30 seconds with some confidence interval. I can do that. Okay, and I'm specifically going to use crowd workers as participants because they stand to earn money from small time increments that map very nicely to how long it takes to do things like two-factor authentication. So full-time crowd workers do tasks, right, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a couple of minutes. 2FA setup can take people between 30 seconds and a minute and a half, so I can map wage earning time lost to the time it takes to set up or receive two-factor messages. The other nice thing about crowd workers as a researcher is the mean hourly wage for a US crowd worker is $5. So if I want to incentivize with, say, twice your hourly wage, that's something I can reasonably do, and that you're going to maybe reasonably care about, as opposed to some other participants. Finally, crowd workers are quite used to thinking about time optimizations as they try to be most efficient when they're doing their tasks, so that's helpful for this work. Okay, so to give a little bit more detail, participants are going to sign up for this account by entering their network ID and creating a password. They're then going to be told information about the study similar to what I just described to you. So they're told that they will be compensated with the money that's left in their bank account at the end of the study. And this particular crowd worker is going to begin the study with $5 in the bank. They have to log in once a day. That's to make sure that if they enable two-factor authentication, they'll get sufficient costs from doing so. And if they're hacked, they lose the money in the account, and we really don't pay them. And they're told this up front, that they can earn between the 25 cents they got for signing up for the study and $5.25 when they conclude. Finally, they're told over the course, should say over the course of the study, not over the course of the study. We can vary different things in this particular setting. So we can test a traditional economic effect called the endowment effect, which says that people care more about what they already have than about things they're earning. So if, for example, instead of giving you $5 up front, I give you $1 up front, and then every day that you log in for 5 days of the study, you earn an additional $1. At the end, you still have the same $5, but you have a different mental framing around whether you started with it to begin. Additionally, I can, of course, vary the hacking percentage. In the set of studies I'll talk about today, we used 1%, 20%, and 50%. Those numbers don't come from actual probabilities of being hacked, but they come from numeracy research, which looks at how people understand percentages, and people can reasonably distinguish between 1, 20, and 50. Actual hacking percentages are not very well measured and would probably be less than 1%, where people's behavior starts getting a little bit strange. Okay, then after you understand this portion of the study, you have the opportunity to enable two-factor authentication. We used SMS-based two-factor because when we did a pilot study with M-Turkers, 98% of the ones we did a pilot study with said they'd had to give up their phone number regularly in M-Turk studies, so they didn't feel particularly privacy sensitive about this. A different population might feel differently. And this particular person is told that two-factor authentication will protect them from hacking 90% of the time. So they had a 20% risk of being hacked. If they enable two-factor, that goes down to 2%. And in the post-surveys for this work, we gave people some simple math problems to make sure they roughly understood the math. Those who choose to, you can also vary the hacking probability. So we vary between, we use 90% and also 50%, which is a coin flip. We actually did some pilots with 100%, but then nobody believed us, so they thought the study was like bogus. So that's how we got to these numbers. If they choose to use two-factor, they get traditional SMS-based 2FA with a code, and if they enable it, then every time they log in, they have to use the code. And in this particular variation that I'll talk about today, they couldn't turn two-factor off. So once you made a decision, that was your decision for the course of the study. We ran these experiments both for a 5-day duration where you logged in daily, and for a 1-month duration where you logged in weekly. The results were actually quite similar. And as I said, they have to log in regularly, and if they don't do the logging in regularly, they lose them. Okay. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, only about half of the participants enabled two-factor. This is within the range, very large range, that white papers put out for 2FA adoption, maybe slightly on the higher side. And for security researchers, what this says to them is, see those users, they're not doing what we want, they're not enabling two-factor, and it's going to protect them. So we want to know why is it that they aren't enabling two-factor? Are they sitting there and flipping coins? Or perhaps are they dominantly rational? Is there some consistent pattern? Are they making cost-risk trade-offs perfectly? Or are they making cost-risk trade-offs in a biased way, or not at all? In order to test that, we wanted to see if we could predict whether or not someone enabled two-factor as a function of the account value. So this is the endowment effect. Did I give you $5 up front or $1 you're earning more? We also tried, say, $5 versus $10. These two actually behave very similarly. So the endowment effect behaves quite similarly to just arbitrary valuation. We include your risk, so how much we told you two-factor would protect you, what chance we told you had of being hacked. And then we also include some controls. So we did measure the strength of the password they created. We didn't tell them that their password strength would have any effect on risk, but they may have thought that from prior experience with security. We also included some validated measures of internet and security skill, as well as demographics. We measured password strength with an existing password strength meter, and internet and security skill with the web use skill index, and then CNIS. It turns out in our first set of experiments, the controls weren't significant. They were not significantly related to two-factor behavior. But our other two factors were. And so it turns out that people who have higher valued accounts are more likely to enable two-factor authentication. So if they had $5 instead of $1 they were earning more of, or if they had $10 instead of $5. So this is nice, this is logical, this is what we'd like to see. And they were also biased based on risk. So if we offered them a more protective two-factor, they're more likely to take it. Higher risk of hacking, they're also more likely to take it. But these two factors only explained about 13% of the variance in behavior. So we're explaining some, but not as much as we would like to be explaining. So we ran a second round of experiments with the same set of people to see if we had learned anything from what they did in the first round of the experiment, and also whether they had learned anything from having experience. And particularly, what we were able to do was add two additional factors. So we added costs. So we found that the amount of time it took you to log into our platform correlated quite highly with how long it took you to do the two-factor authentication task. And in fact, people do not have uniform 2FA login times. So even though we use the same industry standard 2FA system, and we look just at the tab focus time, so hopefully less distractions in here, we see that people have very different times that it's taking them to log in, and they get a little bit better in the second round. And so the amount of time it takes them to sign up and log in for the study without two-factor correlates with these 2FA times. So we're going to plug in their costs from the first part of the study in terms of time spent. And we're also going to plug in their past behavior. What did they decide to do in round one? And when they're put into the second round of the experiment, they're put into a totally different experimental setting. So even if you had a 50% risk of being hacked the first time, they're told, okay, now you're in a new experiment, you might have a 1% risk of being hacked. So it's not necessarily like again, the controls weren't significant here, although there is a correlation between socioeconomic status and those costs. So how long it takes you to do two-factor is correlated with socioeconomic status. But aside from that, the controls are not significant. And what we see is that when we consider just risk and account value and trying to model people's behavior, we explain about 9% of their behavior variance. So we still have significant factors, we're explaining some of those. When we add the costs, we have a significantly better fit model, and we're able to explain 26% of the variance in the behavior. So we're getting closer to good psychology models, say like product purchase behavior in a supermarket. When I add past behavior, I'm explaining 61% of the variance in the behavior. So people really like to anchor to what they've done in the past. And when we ask people about sort of typical 2FA use in subsequent experiments, that's not quite as strong because people behave differently with 2FA on different valuations of accounts, but you still see a strong effect there. Now what this doesn't mean is that people are completely unchangeable. They will switch their behavior, but it takes very extreme risk conditions or cost conditions to do so. So someone who usually doesn't do 2FA, if I put them in a 50% risk condition, they will choose to do 2FA in that case, but in the sort of middle risk conditions, it's a bit hard to adjust behavior. So for the purposes of sort of taking a descriptive approach, what's important to us here is first that people behave, at least in this very controlled setting, in ways that we can model well. So we're not presuming that if we go into the real world, we'll explain 61% of the behavior, but at least in this controlled setting, they're not flipping coins about what they want to do with security. Differences in ability, so differences in cost, do have a significant influence on behavior. This is something the normative approach doesn't take into account. When I'm trying to kind of force you to do two-factor authentication, Google isn't thinking about how long it took you to sign up for Google in the first place, and how easy it's going to be, or whether they should give you extra resources. The other thing is that even though it's not a huge effect, differences in account valuation also meaningfully impact behavior. This is also something we don't currently take into account, and I'm sure some of us have experienced when CVS Care Card wants you to have the world's strongest password and you could really care less. And those things all add up to being part of sort of our compliance budget that we're spending on security. And so when we think about taking less of a normative approach, we're starting to consider the fact that different people have inequities either in ability or in valuation of account that put them at different distances from achieving some security goal. And if we want to try to adjust to meet people where they are or in a place that's reasonable to them, we can think about trying to customize prompts. So perhaps only prompting certain people after their account has reached a certain level of value. So instead of being asked to enable two-factor when you first sign up for Gmail, you get prompted after you've reached 1,000 messages sent back and forth. This is now important to you. We can also imagine allocating resources. So if I'm a very low-skilled user, perhaps I get sent a hardware key instead of doing SMS-based two-factor. Google does this a little bit for journalists who are particularly high risk. They will send them protected hardware. But we'd like to be able to take these preferences and then make a decision, and not just sort of have heuristic rules of like, okay, people who are new to the internet get YubiKeys for 20 days. And so in order to do that, we can use an approach called mechanism design. So this comes out of game theory. It's a way of designing frameworks that we can then optimize later. Mechanism design usually assumes that there's some agent in a system and this agent behaves rationally. But we just saw that end users don't behave rationally with regards to security. So we'd like to design a mechanism where we can optimize over some learned model of user behavior. And what this might look like is we have a company that has a set of users. So you can imagine Gmail or Facebook. And that company has a set of levers that it can use. So it can pick some security behaviors with which to protect its users. And these behaviors have some cost to the company, and they also have some protection value for the users. So let's say there's 10 different 2FA providers, and some of them are more or less secure. That's your protection, and they also cost different amounts to the company. The company also has some messages or prompts it can distribute to its users, and then we introduce that they can have some resources like these YubiKeys or helplines or other kinds of things they can use to lessen user costs. The company also has some user behavior model that it's learned in a similar way to how we did in our bank experiments. And it knows that given some user or some type of user, it's going to predict what the user might do. So it says, okay, given this user's skill and their account value and maybe some knowledge of past behavior, I'm going to predict what behavior the user is going to have. And whether or not the user chooses to enable two-factor authentication might depend a bit on the quality of my system and the quality of the two-factor I offer to them. And their choices are going to relate to my cost model, because if I have users who aren't enabling two-factor and they get hacked and their engagement goes down, I earn less money. And they also influence my cost model in that I have to pay for them to do this security. So a lot of companies worry about suggesting two-factor to users, not only because it will reduce engagement, but because they have to pay for these SMS fees all the time. So they like to make sure that it actually makes sense. Okay, so they're going to produce some set of costs, and that, as well as the users' ad eyeballs, are going to fit into this profit model, and the company is going to optimize over this system. And they're trying to say, what is the best set of prompts and 2FA and resources for different types of users that I might want to put out. And we can turn this into a math equation with some nice constraints about the corporate budget. And if we do some linear programming and solve this optimization, then we have a set of prompts that we can customize to our users. And we have a set of resources we can distribute. So we know which journalists, perhaps, we want to give resources to, or which emerging market users. The other thing that a system like this allows us to do is to add some constraints. So right now, the security community rarely thinks necessarily about fairness. So we don't think about the fact that, like, I have to spend 10 minutes doing the security and you have to spend 1 minute and we both get the same benefit. That's not really considered as part of the equation. So reasoning in this way allows us to put some constraints where we minimize the variance in cost or the variance in risk between different users. And we can set different goals that we might want to have. Okay, so that's sort of the first example of a way in which we can use inferred preference from one of these models to optimize things in such a way that hopefully benefits firms so they get more secure users who don't get hacked, and also benefits users so it's a bit more fair. Next, we'd like to get one step closer. Instead of inferring what users want from their behavior, can we just ask them outright what they would prefer? In this case, I'd like to talk about fair slide, I'd like to talk about feature fairness in machine learning classifiers. So we've talked, I think the community has increasingly talked about this a lot. How do we decide what features to include? Well, thus far we've seen a lot of either kind of mathematical rules for outcome fairness. We can then reason back about whether good data was included or good features were included. Or we have algorithm designers who make sort of normative decisions about whether a feature is fair. The descriptive approach would be to say, okay, instead of doing that or in combination with doing that, can we ask people what they think about the fairness of these different features? And can we then decide which features to include or how heavily to weight them based on people's perceptions of fairness? If you bring up this kind of descriptive approach, one of the first things you get asked is, well, how do people know anything about whether these features should be fair? How do we know that this is well reasoned? And so we have sort of a similar question to the one we had in security, which is, are people really the right ones to listen to? To answer that question, we're going to back up for a moment about why we care about feature fairness in the first place. Do people have opinions about these things? So a number of years ago, there was a lot of press about Google's job advertisement algorithm showing prestigious job ads only to men and not to women. And there was a lot of outcry about this. And one of the questions that came up was, who are people upset about? Who are people upset at and why are they upset? So we can ask, what drives the perceptions of this discrimination scenario? In order to ask that question, we wanted to see whether people's blame lay with Google, who had distributed the ads, with the advertiser had asked for them to be placed, and whether people were upset because the outcome was discriminatory, or was it upsetting that it might have been because of direct targeting of demographic features. So let's try to disentangle, what are people upset? In order to do that, we used a scenario survey. So we presented people a sort of generic scenario similar to the Google one, where we said there's this firm, and it's developing software, and they're expanding and trying to hire new employees. And they're going to place some ads with an advertising network. And an HR employee at the company that's trying to hire, they're asking the advertiser network to target individuals who are Asian rather than individuals who are white. And as a result, the ad is shown more frequently to those who are Asian than those who are white. Well, we can vary this scenario. So instead of directly targeting based on race, we could say, well, the company that's trying to hire asked for the ads be shown to people who had recently visited technology interest websites. And it turns out that those individuals are more likely to be Asian than they are to be white, same outcome. You could also imagine that this is a monetary-based thing. The ad network charges less to reach individuals who are Asian rather than individuals who are white, and so the company that's trying to hire automatically selected the cheapest option. Finally, you could imagine that those who are Asian naturally tend to click on different ads, and so the automated system on the advertising network observed this difference and directed the ad for the computer company without them knowing about it. All of these have the same outcome. And so our question was, what does this do to people's perceptions? Are they upset about all of these things equally, or are some of the scenarios more or less bothersome? In order to ask that question, we collected some training data to train some regression models to predict what we thought would be people's opinions, and then we collected a large sample to see if we could verify those models of response. And what we found was that features were a key part of perceived fairness. So people got very much more or less upset based on whether the discrimination was because race was directly targeted versus because of something such as clicking on more ads or visiting more technology interest websites. So people had a very strong difference in opinion depending on whether it was explicitly demographic or from behavioral. So the dark blue over here is the part where people said this scenario is a serious problem, and we see a significantly larger portion. The dark blue on the right a significantly larger portion for a serious problem when it's directly demographic versus behavioral difference. Interestingly, the mechanism of targeting didn't matter. So whether it was an HR employee who was doing either behavioral or demographic targeting or an algorithm, people don't care. They cared about how the targeting was happening. So we can see here very little difference in blame and not statistically significant. And finally, majority groups perceived that discrimination when a minority group was benefiting as less problematic, but minority groups found the scenarios more problematic overall than majority groups, no matter who was benefiting in the scenario. Okay, so we find from this work, and there's other work in addition, that people care about how these decisions are being made, not just the outcome of the decision. So if we go back to our question of how do we then pick which features are fair to include, we're going to take as a case study the compass system. And the compass system is frequently talked about in algorithmic fairness. This is an algorithm used in Florida to help judges make bail decisions. It takes some features about a defendant and predicts the chance that they will recidivate or commit another crime, and the judge takes this prediction into account when deciding whether or not to release someone on bail. And when people found out about this particular system, there was a large ProPublica article about the type of input features that were going into the system. And there are no legally sensitive features, doesn't take into account race, gender, etc., but it does take into things like mental health status based on a questionnaire, school records from grade school, criminal history of family and friends, as well as things like the current criminal charge. And when this news article came out, people were very upset about this system. And so what we wanted to understand was, can we find a consistent pattern of preferences over the fairness of these kinds of features? And so in the system that Compass has, these input questionnaires become features, which then get fed into their classifier, and this predicts the chance of recidivism. And some people would like to throw out some of these features as unfair. In the old system, it was judges who made these decisions. So judges said, okay, you collected this piece of evidence in a way that violated someone's privacy, you went in their house without a warrant, and throwing out this feature. In the Compass system, it turned out it was algorithm designers or corporate people who were deciding whether or not something was fair to include. And so our question is, what if we followed people's beliefs about fairness, and the people who these systems are being used on, or more broadly the population, got to express opinions over the fairness of features, similar to sort of a jury of your peers. Okay, so in order to find out about people's beliefs around fairness, we did another scenario survey, similar to the first one. So we said, okay, judges in Broward County, Florida, are using a computer program to help them decide which defendants can be released on bail before trial. The program takes into account information about, and then we inserted a description of the feature. So in this case, stability of employment and living situation. For example, the computer program will take into account the defendant's answer to the following question: how often do you have trouble paying bills? We then ask the respondent to rate how much they agree with the following question on a 7-point Likert scale of fairness. How fair is it to determine if a person can be released on bail using information about their stability of employment and living situation? And we pre-tested this survey in a number of different iterations. And we also used 2 different samples, both an MTurk sample and a census representative web panel, and found the findings were very consistent between its 2 samples, which I'll get back to in a minute. Okay, so the first question is, do people have opinions about the fairness of these features? Yes, they very much do. So if you look at the mean fairness rating on this Likert scale, people think it's pretty fair to include the person's current charges and their own criminal history, but they do not think it's particularly fair to include the criminal history of their family and friends, the quality of their social life, or their education and school background. despite the fact that people have strong opinions about these features, there was a lack of consensus on the beliefs. So if we looked at the whole population, there was pretty high variance in how they felt about these features. And the question is that because people are the wrong ones to ask about fairness, or is there some underlying reason why they're different? In order to ask that question, we wanted to see if we could break down the question of fairness into sub-questions. In order to do that, we went through legal and philosophical literature to look at how, in the past, people have reasoned about the idea of fairness. And we found 8 sort of latent properties of fairness in the literature. Is the feature reliable? Is it relevant? Is it private? So the example I gave before, did you get it without a warrant? Is it volitional? This comes up a lot in philosophical literature. If I didn't have control over it, it may not be fair to include, like the criminal history of my parents. Is it causally related to the outcome? Is including it going to cause a vicious cycle? And etc. on causal features. And what we wanted to know was, is it that people are inconsistent in evaluating these properties of a feature? Or are they inconsistent in mapping from the properties to the fairness? Or have we just picked the wrong properties and this is not helpful? We did another set of surveys to assess people's judgments of these properties. And what we found was that given knowledge of their property judgments, we had 88% accuracy in predicting how fair they thought it was to use the feature. So there's very consistent mapping between latent properties of features and the fairness of using the features. And when we broke out to have different classifiers for different subgroups, different populations, we got at most like a 2% improvement in accuracy. So we see a very consistent mapping function. So if you and I agree about our scoring of these latent properties, we agree about fairness. But if we disagree about our scoring of the latent properties, then we disagree about fairness. And we see some nice patterns here, especially with political leaning, where right-leaning groups consistently rate the volitionality and the privacy of features differently than left-leaning groups. So we can make some clear cuts. Okay. So what we find here is a little bit different than the security case. So people are quite consistent in their mapping from properties to fairness, but they're not very good at rating the properties. They're sort of all over the board about these reliability and causality measurements. And that perhaps makes sense, because we as lay people aren't really trained to think about whether something is relevant in a particular legal decision, but we do have a consistent feeling about, given that it is or isn't relevant, or how relevant it is, whether or not it's fair to include. And so here we may want a partnership, where judges or normative experts do some of the judging of the latent properties, and we use human mapping function from properties to fairness to augment those beliefs, so that we're not sort of just using the expert opinions to get to fairness. For in the future, we might hope that we could computationally evaluate some of these properties. People are doing a lot of work trying to see whether something can be proven to cause a vicious cycle. If we could make progress on that problem, then we could feed in that evidence without even needing an expert judgment here. If we use these human preferences, we can then do something similar to what we did in the prior problem, where we can constrain the search for features based on a fairness threshold. So I again have an optimization problem where, given a bucket of features that have some y impact on accuracy and some z impact on fairness, I can try to optimize to pick the best combination of features to accommodate the fairness threshold and also accommodate a preference for higher accuracy. Okay. So in the last little bit, I'm going to talk about an example where we're not even going to model preferences or model behavior. We're just going to work directly with the stakeholders or users to come up with some decisions that might usually be made by an expert. In this particular case, I'd like to talk about virtual reality. So in some work that I did a couple of years ago, we were doing a set of interview studies looking at security and privacy in virtual reality. And something that came up when we were talking specifically to virtual reality developers was they were like, well, I don't know what I should be doing. I don't know what the guidelines are. Researchers, will you tell me what the guidelines are? And we were like, ooh, descriptive opportunity. Maybe you can tell you what the guidelines are. And so this was our motivation, right? They were like, well, there's a big list of unknowns in terms of what's best etiquette for the user and what's going to keep the user safe. And there's not very many VR power users. I haven't met any. How do I come up with this code of ethics or set of design guidelines? And so what we decided to do is we said, okay, let's co-design a code of ethics with the VR developers. We're going to take a set of principles that came out of our interview studies with users and developers that seem to be common, and we're going to put them in a Google Doc, and we're going to invite 11 online communities of VR developers to edit those principles and come up with their own code of ethics. And we told them, you could change the high-level principles we stuck in there. We didn't flesh them out at all. Let's just see what happens. We have no idea if this will work. And so this is what the document looked like in the midst of the VR developers editing. So over the course of the 7 days, we had this document up. It had about 1,000 views. Of those 1,000 views, 245 of them were people who could potentially edit the document, so they were on a desktop or Google Drive app as opposed to just sort of mobile view. Of those 245 potential editors, 19 people directly edited the document, often multiple times. 7 shared it, often with the like, hey X, will you look at this and see if it looks okay? And this proportion of sort of potential editing to editors is similar to what we'll see with Wikipedia editing, just on a much smaller scale. And we saw 40 unique contributions. And some of these contributions, which is quite hard to see here, were additions of entire guidelines. Others were sort of back and forth conversations. So we saw a lot of conversation around the accessibility principle. So we didn't have an accessibility principle in there when we started. And one VR developer added accessibility for all, and they said, all experiences should be accessible to all kinds of people. And a different developer came in and they said, no, 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 that's going to ruin things because I can't possibly make it accessible, and I want to delete this. And the third person came in and was like, okay, let me try to find the middle ground. And they added a set of sentences saying, well, you should develop things in a modular way and be transparent about what people need in order to make it accessible to them. So like if they need some special screen reader software or something in VR, you should be transparent. And the fourth person kind of came in and cleaned up this whole editing mess. So we see this sort of back and forth negotiation that went on for some of these principles. At the end, we ended up with 10 principles. So we started with 6. They kind of totally rewrote 2 of them, and then they added 4 more. And in the paper, there's some ethnographic sort of analysis of these editing processes. And at the end, we got a high-level document for standards of ethical development in VR. And what excited us the most, probably more than the development of the document, was that after the different communities had engaged in this project, they started taking action on it. So we saw people going and saying, hey guys, I built a library for asking people about whether they were harmed in this experience. So it was like a little thing for asking liker questions. You can use that to do some principle 1. So involving them in the creation of the document, at least to us, seemed to get a lot more buy-in than if we had sort of descended into these developer communities and said, hey, University of Maryland or the ACM or whatever has come up with some principles for you, here you go. And so that's a big benefit from these descriptive approaches to us. That said, there's sort of different methods appropriate for different problems. I don't think, walking out even to myself or even to this room and saying, hey, what level of security do you need for your bank account? That's probably an unreasonable question to ask you. So there's sort of a continuum where you may want to observe behavior and infer what would be good for people versus working directly with them. And also when you're doing this sort of direct co-design, there's also the question of who you're co-designing with, right? If I co-design with perhaps the wrong set of people, I may end up with some standards that aren't what I'm looking for. And as a case study of that, People often ask why we didn't have VR users engaged in this co-design. And this was an ethical or normative kind of ethical decision we made, which is when we were doing the interview study with VR users, we got a lot of comments like, if you use VR, you most likely use Reddit because there's a certain kind of crowd that's really into this, and it's someone with a lot of money who has a premium setup, and you're talking to people with at least 4 sensors, and I'll be more concerned about virtual crimes and bullying once VR is accessible to the general public. So we got a lot of sort of gated community. I'm quite happy with how it is now. Thank you. Don't invite anyone else. And if you do, that's where we're going to have safety problems. And so as the researchers, we were like, maybe this isn't the right community to co-design with right now. Whereas with VR developers, we have a different opinion. And so to that point, there's sort of always a balance between the descriptive and the normative. In security, right, experts have to judge the effectiveness of these behaviors. Users aren't necessarily the right ones to do that. Whether experts are is maybe another open question. In the machine learning case, we need experts to judge these property values, perhaps of relevance or causality. And in VR, we needed researchers to judge whether these communities were good ones to design it. And so you have sort of an endlessly nesting set of things here where we could try to, descriptively or normatively decide whether descriptively or normatively to decide something else. You have to sort of decide where in this chain you would like to stop. And with that, I am happy to take questions and hope this gets people thinking a little bit about descriptive solutions for some of their computational problems. Thank you. Some level of experimentation here. So I think currently we're in a space where experts' opinions have been given all of the weight. Whether that means you're correct by really heavily leading on the user side, maybe not. But I think sort of gradually adding in sort of this user feedback. So let's say I add in some user feedback about how they would prefer 2FA prompting to happen. And if I look at security outcomes of the number of compromised accounts when I have a small test set where I've added in the user feedback, if I've improved things or stayed the same, I then expand maybe either the level of feedback I'm taking into account or the set of people that I'm listening to. In the legal domain, this is a bit harder because A, I think we have more severe outcomes that we're dealing with. B, though, sometimes there's 2 sets of experts. So I think right now, these classification systems are trying to give feedback to judges who are also experts. So it's machine learning experts trying to give feedback to judge experts who have 2 different sets of domain expertise. And I think some amount of sort of transparency there is probably the best way to go. We're able to sort of learn some confidence measure for how well judges do in making these decisions, and we know some confidence in how well the classifiers do, obviously with biased data sets. Right now, we don't really put that on the table, right? No one says this judge is X% accurate or this classifier is X% accurate. So I think giving both sets of experts that information and letting them say, hey, when the judge is more confident, maybe the classifier doesn't say anything. When the classifier is more confident than the judge usually performs on this kind of case, it tells the judge that. So letting them have more agency is one theory. How well that will work, I don't know. Yeah?
Well, thanks for the talk. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. I have a question about the middle part. So,
yeah.
So I like the general idea of trying to ask people what's fair. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting approach. Did you ask anything about features that might have been particularly tricky, that might have, for example, looked fair on their face, but reflected some deep unfairness actually embedded in their data. So I just got my mortgage refinance, and so I'm going to use that as an example. So
Yeah.
let's say you were building a system to predict whether to approve somebody for a mortgage, and you had a feature that said whether they were approved for a mortgage in the past, right? Might on its face look fair, but actually might reflect redlining.
Yes.
So how do you, I'm particularly interested in these really tricky edge cases where people, it seems likely to me that people may not be able to see through the feature to what's actually going on.
Absolutely. So we're doing a set of follow-up experiments that have not yet got at that problem, because that's probably the hardest one, which is how does the kind of cascade effect inform things, which I might argue could be a case, right, where we want people's surface preferences and then we want to act on behalf of what they sort of meant the fairness to be, right? Like if I think, you know, past experience is okay, but it turns out that past experience is actually predicted by these other things I think are unfair, then I, as the system, need to go follow that path for you. One thing we are looking at, though, that we didn't take into account here is even more simple, which is that deciding which features to include affects the accuracy of the classifier. And the accuracy of the classifier is a form of fairness in that perhaps I would like, you know, I think it's more fair to be judged by a thing that's very good at judging me. If I don't include this feature and that drops accuracy 20%, then how do I make those trade-offs? That's already kind of complicated for me to think about. Or sort of what you're getting at is X correlated with Y. Can people even reason about that? Up until some point, maybe, but some N correlates later, no. So I think that's still kind of a place for a combination of like, what do they want, and then how do we execute that for them given our knowledge of the system or how that feature got to be. Yeah.
Have you dug a little deeper into why do experts disagree and what is that based on?
Good question. I have not, although it's becoming increasingly interesting to me, because I just finished a large study where we had experts evaluate 400 different security behaviors that get recommended to users. And while they didn't necessarily disagree, they all agreed that all the behaviors were great, or at least 90% of them were great. So they want everybody doing like, 360 of these security behaviors. My hypothesis is some of it has to do with context. So if I'm a security person who works on dissidents who have really severe privacy risks, then what I think are super important behaviors may be very different than someone who works with older adults who have very limited internet skill. And whether neither of us might be wrong, but we might be sort of wrong in a given context. So I think that's one hypothesis. The other is that there's a lot of unfalsifiability in these spaces, right? Like I can always prove something can be broken. It's very hard to prove you're secure enough or fair enough or whatever, and so we end up with this sort of endless stack. And then which subset of the endless stack I pick, we can just... Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on like people distrust in institutions? So for example, if I give Facebook my phone number, now apparently people can search for me using my number that I provide for them only for security purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something we see a lot in sort of the general population. Like if you ask people why they don't do, let's say, two-factor, at least 15% of them is because of privacy concerns, which to be perfectly fair, like Facebook has used people's phone numbers that they gave for security to do everything. So that's not an inaccurate fact model. That puts us in a, if we start from the premise that people ought to have two-factor, that puts us in a very difficult place, right? In that you have to rebuild trust, and that there's often tension where, kind of getting back to this idea of context, right? One kind of protection gives me another kind of exposure. Like adding two-factor to my Facebook does protect it, but it also opens up a privacy threat. And that's something we haven't necessarily looked a lot at, is like how kind of opening one door closes another window, so to speak. I think that kind of the intersection of privacy with safety and security is something we're going to see a lot more work on, but I hope there is more work on it, and I was talking to Cliff about this a little bit. It's often been treated quite separately.
Yeah, I had a question about the, so the reason for excluding the VR users, because it seemed like it was because it was a very specific community.
Mhm.
And could the same not be said about the VR developers? Like it's also a very specific type of person who like develops software in the first place, like the VR development. So what made you look at developers and say that ETS?
Yeah, please no. Yeah, very, very fair point. For us, there was a couple of things. So the VR users, in terms of the sample we were able to gather in our various sampling methods, were like demographically homogeneous, opinion homogeneous, just like very homogeneous set of people. For whatever reason, VR developers are actually less homogeneous than sort of regular developers, both in terms of demographics and in background. So there's like a combination of sort of art background, development background, and even sort of other industries that have gotten into VR as, you know, a tool. And so when we were doing the qualitative work, the kind of opinions we were getting from the VR developers were really diverse. And we thought that was important for doing this co-creation, kind of similar to how we want to get diverse opinions in like any kind of qualitative work. Given that the VR users were so homogeneous, we didn't have great confidence we'd get any of that variety. One thing we've thought about doing, but we haven't done yet, is to take this set of ethical guidelines and bring it to the users and see what they would do with it, or let them kind of start from scratch and see what different things would we come up with, and then either we negotiate sort of the agreement between them or they do. We haven't done that yet.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the code of ethics that you co-designed with the VR developers, and if there were things in there that came up that were similar or different from code of ethics in developing other types of computing technologies and such.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely saw some similar things to, especially codes for like mobile app development in terms of like privacy and some of the accessibility kind of stuff. The main difference we saw was around harms. That was something that we didn't see coming up a lot in other development spaces, but did seem to be a big focus in VR. So these are things like people getting nauseated from using the tool, or people having an experience where maybe they experience some kind of like physical assault in a virtual space, and like, you know, how seriously do we have to take that? Is that something that people should be entitled to want to opt into? These kind of questions, which we haven't seen as much even in the gaming space, I think because of this difference in like modality interaction. That was the main difference we saw. I'd be really curious to see like a AR set of guidelines, which I haven't come across, but if someone has them, let me know, versus VR, because they're often sort of equated, but there's a really big difference in terms of like being completely immersed versus overlaying something on the real world. But some of the things are similar, right? Like some people brought up, like, what if they trip over a chair and then they sue me because the VR application made them trip over a chair? I don't know. So those were.
In the code of ethics, did you get a sense that the participants in that study kind of wanted to also cover up their, you know, protect themselves proactively as developers, or?
Yes. You know, we saw, yes, they did. I would say their first motivation seemed to be, I don't want to do something bad to people. There was a bit of CYA going on as well, and we actually saw a big difference specifically for data storage. So when we were doing the interviews, developers were like, yeah, I collect user data and I send it to the cloud, and it's cloud provider's problem, without a lot of thought of like, you know, when I transmit the data and blah, 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 I could have some problems. For physical safety and like these kind of harms and emotional stuff, they seem to take that on themselves. Whereas like some of the more traditional stuff, they were like, yeah, it's the cloud provider, or I'll shove it in a privacy policy that no one will read and I'm good. Maybe that's encouraging because the physical harms might be even more severe, but it was an interesting sort of cut, and I don't know if that's because traditionally they know about privacy and haven't dealt with physical stuff before or something else. Yeah.
Well, that's all the questions we have today. Let's give a round of applause. Walter, do you want to be in charge of?
Sure.
Otherwise, I will bring her to the open space and you can find her.
Yeah.
Okay.